They called him Zachariah, a slave with calloused hands, a steady back, and a fire buried so deep it looked like silence. Day after day he bowed his head, watched his sister suffer, watched the whip carve lines across his own skin, until one night something in him broke. With nothing but rope and rage, Zachariah dragged his master to the old oak tree. The same tree where others had swung in terror now held the body of the man who once owned him. And when the dawn came, the plantation wasn't standing, it was burning. What began as vengeance turned into a revolt. Families who had known only chains now carried knives, torches, and the taste of freedom on their tongues. But freedom bought with blood has its own cost, and Zachariah would soon learn hanging one man was only the beginning. The question was, could he survive the fire he started? Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The stars still glittered in the black sky when Zachariah opened his eyes. The cabin was dark except for a small circle of golden light where his sister huddled near a stub of candle. Mercy's fingers traced across a wrinkled scrap of paper, her lips moving silently as she formed each word. "In the beginning was the Word," she whispered, "and the Word was with God." Zachariah pushed himself up from his thin pallet. The dirt floor felt cool beneath his calloused feet as he moved to his sister's side. At 22, Mercy was thin but strong, her eyes bright with intelligence, even in the dim light. "You shouldn't read so early," he said softly. "Someone might see the light." Mercy smiled but didn't look up from the torn Bible page. "The morning bell won't ring for an hour yet." Everyone's still sleeping. Zachariah glanced at the cracks in the wooden walls where dawn hadn't yet begun to show. His chest tightened with worry. He had taught Mercy her letters in secret, tracing shapes in the dirt and later scratching them onto scraps of bark when they could steal away to the edge of the cotton fields. It had taken years of careful moments stolen between endless work. "If Master Thornton finds out," he began. "He won't," Mercy said, finally looking up. Her eyes held the same stubborn look she'd had since childhood. "Knowledge is freedom, Zach." "You told me that." Zachariah touched the torn page gently. "I know, but freedom's dangerous on this plantation." Outside, the first gray light of dawn began to seep into the world. Mercy quickly folded the precious paper and slid it beneath a loose floorboard under her sleeping pallet. Just as she pressed the board back into place, the morning bell began to clang harshly across the plantation. "Another day," Zachariah sighed, reaching for his worn shirt. The fields stretched out endlessly under the rising summer sun. By mid-M morning, heat shimmered above the rows of cotton. Zachariah worked steadily, his fingers bleeding from the sharp cotton bolls, his back aching from bending. Every few minutes he glanced down the row to check on Mercy. Old Moses, who had to be at least 60, worked 3 rows over. His movements had grown slower over the years, his hands twisted with pain. Zachariah watched as Moses straightened up too slowly, a basket of cotton slipping from his grasp and spilling across the ground. The crack of a whip split the air. "Clumsy old fool!" shouted Jenkins, the overseer. His face was red with anger and drink even this early in the day. "Pick it up every last bit." Moses dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he tried to gather the scattered cotton. The whip cracked again, this time cutting across Moses's back. The old man cried out, falling forward. Zachariah moved without thinking, stepping between rows. "I'll help him," he said quickly, keeping his eyes down. "Well, get it done faster." Jenkins's small eyes narrowed. "You mind your place, boy." But he lowered the whip, his attention caught by something at the edge of the field. Zachariah knelt beside Moses, helping him gather the cotton. "You all right?" he whispered. Moses nodded slightly, his breathing ragged. "Master Thornton's in a mood today. Lost some big money deal in Charleston. They, when the master's angry. We all suffer, Zachariah finished, helping Moses to his feet. Throughout the endless afternoon, whispers passed between the workers. Master Thornton had gambled on a shipment of goods that had been seized at port. His business partner had abandoned him, leaving Thornton with the debts. Everyone knew what this meant. Harder work, less food, and a quicker temper from the master and his overseers. When sunset finally came, Zachariah's muscles screamed with exhaustion. He and Mercy walked back to the quarters together, too tired for words. All around them, other workers moved like shadows, heads down, spirits crushed under another day's labor. In their cabin, Mercy heated a small pot of cornmeal over the tiny fire they were allowed. They ate in silence, saving the few scraps for breakfast. "Maybe he'll sell the plantation," Mercy said suddenly, "if Master Thornton's in debt." "Don't get hopeful," Zachariah warned. "New masters ain't usually better than old ones." Before Mercy could answer, boots stomped outside their door. The thin wooden planks crashed open, and Silas Thornton himself stood in the doorway. His face was flushed with whiskey, his eyes wild with anger. "Search it," he ordered the two men behind him. Every corner. Zachariah and Mercy pressed themselves against the wall as the men tore through their few possessions. One man flipped over Mercy's sleeping pallet, exposing the loose floorboard beneath. "What's this?" The man pried up the board and pulled out the folded Bible page. Thornton snatched it from the man's hand, his face darkening as he looked at the paper, then at Mercy. "You can read," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Mercy's eyes widened with fear. "No, Master, I just don't lie to me." Thornton roared, grabbing her arm. "Who taught you? Who?" Zachariah stepped forward. Nobody taught her. She just found that paper. Thornton's hand cracked across Zachariah's face, sending him stumbling backward. "I wasn't speaking to you." The master turned back to Mercy, crumpling the Bible page in his fist. His face had grown coldly calm, which was more frightening than his rage. "Reading," he said softly. "A slave with ideas is a danger to everyone." He looked straight at Zachariah. "I've been too soft with your sister. My mistake." Thornton stepped back toward the door. "She'll be sold at dawn. The Carolina trader is passing through. He pays well for young women." His eyes moved over Mercy in a way that made Zachariah's blood boil. "Pack nothing. She won't need it where she's going." The door slammed shut. Through the thin walls, they could hear Thornton instructing his men to post guards around the quarters for the night. Zachariah gathered Mercy in his arms as she began to sob, her body shaking with terror. He held her tight, rocking her like he had when they were children, and their mother had been sold away. His face remained expressionless, but inside something had snapped free. Something dark and determined that had been chained down for years. He stared at the closed door, saying nothing, as Mercy wept against his chest. His silence held more danger than any words could express. Night wrapped around the slave quarters like a suffocating blanket. The usual sounds of quiet conversation and muffled singing were absent. Instead, a heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by occasional whispers as news of Mercy's fate spread from cabin to cabin. Inside their small space, Zachariah sat on the edge of his pallet, watching Mercy's tear-stained face. She finally slept. Exhaustion had claimed her after hours of sobbing. Her cheeks were still wet, her breathing uneven, even in sleep. Zachariah's hand moved beneath his pallet, fingers wrapping around cold metal. He pulled out a length of rusted iron chain he'd hidden months ago, a broken piece from the field equipment he'd been ordered to repair. He'd kept it, not knowing why at the time, only feeling that someday it might be useful. The chain felt heavy in his hands. Its links were thick and rough with rust, but strong. In the dim light, it seemed to absorb the darkness rather than reflect it. "I promised Mama I'd keep you safe. he whispered to his sleeping sister. Memories washed over him, teaching 5-year-old Mercy to count stars through the holes in their cabin roof. Holding her hand when their mother was sold away, watching her grow into a woman with a mind so sharp it frightened him sometimes. Tomorrow, a trader would take her to who knows where, the rice fields that drowned workers in fever-filled swamps, or worse, to one of those houses where young women served another purpose entirely. Zachariah's fingers tightened around the chain until his knuckles turned white. The guards outside wouldn't expect anyone to leave the cabins tonight. They were there to keep people in until dawn, until selling time. He rose silently, tucking the chain inside his shirt. It felt cold against his skin. He bent to kiss Mercy's forehead gently, then slipped through the door, keeping to the shadows. The night air felt thick, heavy with the scent of jasmine and the promise of rain. Moonlight spilled across the plantation, turning everything silver and black. Zachariah moved like a shadow himself, staying low, using every skill learned from years of secretly meeting with slaves from neighboring plantations. He knew where Master Thornton would be. When in a celebrating mood or an angry one, Silas Thornton often drank in the grove near the big house, seated beneath the sprawling oak that dominated the small rise of land. The hanging tree, they called it. 3 men had died there last spring when cotton went missing from the storehouse. Zachariah had been forced to watch along with every other slave on the plantation. "Let this be a lesson," Thornton had said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd as the men kicked and struggled, their faces turning purple, tongues protruding as life left them. The memory of those swinging bodies drove Zachariah forward now, through the vegetable garden, past the smokehouse, and into the stand of trees that separated the slave quarters from the main house. The great oak stood at the center of the grove, its massive branches stretching out like gnarled fingers against the night sky. A lantern burned at its base, illuminating Silas Thornton as he sat on a wooden chair, a bottle in his hand. He looked smaller somehow, outside the context of his authority, just a man drinking alone in the night. Zachariah crouched in the underbrush, watching. The master's face was flushed, his movements unsteady as he raised the bottle to his lips again and again. No one else was nearby. The overseers were probably in their quarters, resting for the early morning sale. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The air grew heavier, the scent of coming rain stronger. Zachariah's heart pounded in his chest, blood rushing in his ears. He thought of Mercy's face, of their mother's last words before being taken away. "You're the man now. Protect your sister." He had failed unless he acted now. Zachariah pulled the chain from his shirt, feeling its weight, testing its strength. His mind went strangely quiet, as if a curtain had dropped between him and his thoughts. Another swallow from the bottle, and Thornton's head tilted back. His eyes closed briefly in the lantern light. That moment of vulnerability was all Zachariah needed. He moved forward in a low crouch, silent as death itself. 3 steps, 2, 1. And then he was behind the oak tree, just feet from his master. Thornton sensed something, started to turn his head, but too late. Zachariah lunged, looping the chain around Thornton's throat in one fluid motion. The bottle crashed to the ground as Thornton's hands flew up, clawing at the metal links, cutting into his flesh. "You won't take her," Zachariah hissed into his ear, pulling the chain tighter. Thornton's legs kicked out, his chair toppling backward. His weight fell against Zachariah, but years of cotton picking had made the slave stronger than his master ever knew. Zachariah held firm, dragging the struggling man toward the tree trunk. The hanging rope was still there, as it always was, a constant reminder to the enslaved of what awaited disobedience. With one hand maintaining pressure on the chain, Zachariah grabbed the rope with the other. Thornton's face had gone purple, his eyes bulging, fingers still scratching desperately at the chain. Small, choking sounds escaped his throat as Zachariah connected the chain to the hanging rope and pulled. Using all his strength, Zachariah hoisted his master upward until Thornton's feet left the ground. The man's body jerked violently, his legs kicking at empty air. Zachariah secured the rope to the iron hook embedded in the tree trunk, the same hook that had claimed so many black lives over the years. And then suddenly it was done. Silas Thornton, master of 400 acres and 57 human beings, hung from his own hanging tree, his body twisted slowly in the night breeze, the lantern below casting monstrous shadows across the grove. Zachariah stepped back, his chest heaving with exertion and emotion. Rain began to fall, gentle at first, then harder, plastering his shirt to his skin. The water mixed with sweat on his face, cooling the burn of what he had just done. The hanging tree now bore strange fruit indeed. For the first time in Zachariah's memory, a white man swung from its branches. He stood motionless in the downpour, watching Thornton's body turn slowly in the wind. The rushing in his ears had stopped. The world seemed unnaturally silent, as if holding its breath. Nothing would ever be the same again. Dawn broke across the plantation with screams that sliced through the morning air. Zachariah sat on his pallet, exhausted from a sleepless night, his hands still feeling the ghost of the chain. The first shrieks came from near the big house. A house slave had found Master Thornton swinging from the oak. "Lord have mercy, Master's dead. The Master's been hung." The cry echoed across the yard, carried on the damp morning breeze. Mercy bolted upright, her eyes wide with fear. "Zachariah, what's happening?" Before he could answer, the door to their cabin burst open. Old Isaiah stood there, his weathered face a mask of disbelief. They're saying, "Master Thornton's hanging from the oak, just like he done to our people." Mercy's hand flew to her mouth. She looked at Zachariah, at the dirt under his fingernails, at the strange calm in his eyes. Understanding dawned on her face. "What you done?" she whispered. Zachariah stood slowly. "What needed doing?" Outside, chaos erupted. People poured from their cabins, some wailing in terror, others standing in stunned silence. The overseers scrambled to contain the situation, shouting and brandishing whips. Thornton's body still hung from the tree, visible across the clearing, a sight never before seen on this land, a master strung up like those he had tormented. "They'll kill us all for this," a woman cried, clutching her child to her chest. "We should run," another voice urged. "Head for the swamps before they come for us." Panic rippled through the gathering crowd, but then something unexpected happened. Big John, afield and known for his quiet ways, stepped forward. He'd worked the Thornton land for 30 years, his back scarred from countless whippings. "Run where?" His deep voice cut through the fear. "They'll hunt us down like dogs. And even if we get away, what then? More chains waiting somewhere else?" He turned to Zachariah. "You did this?" All eyes shifted to Zachariah. Mercy stood beside him now, her small hand slipping into his larger one. Zachariah nodded once. He was going to sell Mercy, sell her away. A murmur ran through the crowd. They all knew what that meant. What happened to young women sold south? "Well then," Big John said, "seems to me the time for running is over." From the direction of the overseer's cabin came shouts and the crack of a whip. 3 white men approached, their faces twisted with rage. "Get back to your quarters," Jenkins, the head overseer, bellowed. "Nobody moves until we sort this out." The crowd hesitated, caught between lifelong obedience and the strange new possibility hanging from the oak tree. Jenkins cracked his whip again, catching a young man across the cheek. Blood spattered, something snapped in the air like an invisible thread stretched too tight. Big John moved first, grabbing a shovel propped against a nearby cabin. Others followed, seizing tools, rocks, anything that could serve as a weapon. The overseers backpedaled, suddenly aware of the change. Jenkins raised his rifle, but before he could fire, Zachariah lunged forward, tackling him to the ground. The rifle discharged into the air. Hands grabbed it. More shots rang out as the other overseers tried to regain control, but they were outnumbered 50-1. The struggle was brief and brutal. When it ended, 3 white men lay dead in the dirt, and their weapons belonged to the enslaved. Silence fell, heavy with the weight of what had just happened. No one had planned this, yet here they stood. 54 men and women who had awakened, expecting another day of bondage, now holding bloody tools and captured guns. Zachariah, Mercy's voice trembled, her eyes were wide with terror, but something else burned there too, determination. They'll send more men. We need to decide now. Zachariah looked at the faces around him, people he'd worked beside for years, suffered beside. Their expressions reflected his own tumbling emotions. Fear, disbelief, and a dangerous spark of hope. "What's there to decide?" he said finally. "We're already dead if we stay put." Big John nodded. "Main house has guns. Ammunition, too, and food," added an older woman. "Stores that'll last weeks." The decision formed without words, a collective understanding passing through the group. Zachariah picked up Jenkins's fallen rifle, checking it was loaded. "They made us build everything they have," he said. "Time we took it back." The group moved as one toward the main house, some armed with guns, others with farm tools and kitchen knives. The few house slaves who hadn't fled joined them, leading the way through the grand front doors that none of them had ever used before. Inside, panic reigned. White faces, servants, a tutor. The housekeeper stared in horror as the rebels flooded in. They were quickly subdued, locked in the root cellar beneath the kitchen. Mercy found her way to Thornton's study, where leather-bound ledgers recorded the purchase and sale of human beings, including the planned transaction that would have sent her away that very morning. She dragged them into the yard, her small frame straining under their weight. "Here," she said, dropping them at Zachariah's feet. "All the papers that say we're property." Others joined her, bringing deeds, bills of sale, maps of the plantation with their cabins marked like livestock pens. Someone found a can of lamp oil in the kitchen and splashed it over the pile. Zachariah struck a match. The flame danced between his fingers for a moment, small, fragile, yet powerful beyond measure. He dropped it onto the oil-soaked papers. Fire leaped up with a whoosh, hungry and bright. Black smoke billowed toward the morning sky as generations of bondage turned to ash. The flames grew higher, catching on a curtain billowing from an open window. Soon, the corner of the house itself began to burn. No one moved to stop it. Instead, they watched in silence as the grand house that had been built by their ancestors' forced labor began to crumble. Zachariah turned toward the oak grove. From where he stood, he could see Silas Thornton's body, still swaying gently in the breeze, now illuminated by the orange glow of firelight. The hanging tree had claimed many victims over the years. Now it held the master himself, a grim banner announcing that everything had changed. The rebellion had begun. Gray dawn broke over the Thornton plantation, revealing a world transformed. Wisps of smoke still rose from the charred skeleton of the main house, twisting like ghosts against the pale morning sky. The air smelled of ash and something else, something new and dangerous. Freedom. Zachariah stood on what remained of the front porch, surveying the changed landscape. His body ached from a night without sleep, but his mind remained sharp, alert to the dangers that surely lay ahead. Behind him, the rebels moved with purpose through the smoking ruins, salvaging what could be used and destroying what could not. "Found more ammunition," Big John announced, approaching with a wooden box, hidden under the floorboards in the study. Most everything else burned, but these were protected. Zachariah nodded, taking the box. "Distribute it to anyone who knows how to shoot. Make sure they understand. No wasting bullets." Across the yard, Mercy had set up a makeshift medical station under the shade of a sycamore tree. She tore strips from a fine linen tablecloth, using them to bind wounds. Several men and women had been injured in yesterday's fighting, nothing fatal but painful all the same. As Zachariah watched, she gently cleaned a gash on young Isaiah's arm, her movements careful and sure, despite her exhaustion. "She's got a healer's touch," Big John observed. "My mama was the same way." "Always has," Zachariah replied, "even as a child." A commotion near the edge of the property drew their attention. 3 figures sprinted across the fields. The scouts they'd sent out at first light to watch the roads. Their speed and the urgency in their movements sent a chill down Zachariah's spine. The fastest of them, a young man named Daniel, reached Zachariah first, his chest heaving. "They're coming," he gasped. "Edward Thornton. He's got riders with him, 20, maybe 30 men, armed. They're about 5 men out, moving fast." A heavy silence fell over those close enough to hear. Edward Thornton was known to be even crueler than his father, quick to anger and slow to forgive. And now he was returning to find his father hanging from a tree and his home in ashes. "How long?" Zachariah asked. 2 hours, maybe less if they push their horses." Zachariah turned to the gathered crowd, now growing as word spread of the scouts' return. Faces that had been alive with triumph just hours before now showed fear creeping back in. "We need to go," a woman called out. "Head for the swamps before they get here." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. The swamps that bordered the plantation had long been a refuge for runaways, dangerous, disease-ridden, but vast enough to hide in. "And then what?" Zachariah's voice cut through the chatter. "Split up and get picked off one by one. You think they won't hunt us down?" "Better than staying here to be slaughtered," someone countered. Mercy approached, wiping blood from her hands onto her apron. "We have wounded who can't travel fast. If we run, some get left behind. You know what happens then." They all knew. The examples made of captured runaways were designed to haunt nightmares, slow deaths that served as warnings to others. Zachariah looked at the faces before him, men and women who had tasted one day of freedom after lifetimes of bondage. He saw the fear there, but also something that hadn't existed before: choice. For the first time, they were deciding their own fates. "Listen to me," he said, his voice steady. "Running means scattering. Scattering means dying alone in those swamps, or being hunted down like animals. We stay together. We might have a chance against 30 armed men," someone called out. "Against men who expect us to run," Zachariah countered, "who see us as property, not people who can. Fight back. We have weapons now. We know this land better than they do, and they don't know how many of us there are." Big John stepped forward. "I'm with Zachariah. I ain't running no more." One by one, others joined in, some reluctantly, others with fierce determination. A plan began to take shape. The plantation had natural defenses they could use: drainage ditches that could slow riders, hedge that offered cover, barns and outbuildings that could become fortresses. They worked through the day, preparing as best they could. Some dug deeper trenches across the main approach road. Others gathered weapons, not just the seized guns, but also scythes, pitchforks, axes from the tool shed. The strongest among them rolled heavy barrels into strategic positions for cover. Mercy organized those who couldn't fight, mostly children and the elderly, moving them to the relative safety of the smokehouse, a solid brick structure away from likely battle areas. She distributed food salvaged from the kitchen stores, ensuring everyone ate something to keep up their strength. As daylight began to fade, a strange calm settled over the plantation. They had done all they could. Now they waited. Zachariah checked his rifle one last time, counting the bullets in his pocket. 12 shots. They would have to count. Mercy appeared at his side, her face smudged with soot, but her eyes clear and determined. "Whatever happens," she said softly, "you already saved me. Remember that." He wanted to tell her it wasn't over, that he would keep her safe. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he squeezed her hand. The first hint came as a distant rumble, like thunder, but steady and growing louder. Hoof beats, many horses moving fast. "Get to your positions," Zachariah called out. "Remember, wait for the signal." The rebels scattered to their assigned places, behind barrels, inside buildings, lying flat in ditches. Zachariah crouched behind the stone wall that once marked the elegant border of Thornton's garden. The hoof-beats grew louder, and then voices carried on the evening air. A familiar voice raised in anger. "I want every last one of them alive, if possible. I want the pleasure of watching them die slowly." Edward Thornton's voice cracked with fury. "My father built this place. My family owned this land." The riders appeared at the edge of the property, torches lighting their way as darkness fell. Edward rode at their head, his face contorted with rage as he saw the smoking ruins of his home. His voice carried across the fields again, cold and vengeful. "I promise you this. There will be nothing left of you but memory when I'm done. Every slave who raised a hand will hang from that tree alongside my father. Every child born to your women will be sold south. Your very names will be erased from this earth." Zachariah gripped his musket tighter, jaw clenched against the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. There was no turning back now. The only path forward led through Edward, Thornton, and his men. As night fully descended, he gave the signal, 3 short whistles that sounded like a whip or Will's call. Around the plantation, the rebels readied themselves for what was to come. The battle for their freedom was about to begin. Dawn broke with a heavy mist clinging to the fields. The cotton plants, once symbols of their bondage, now provided hiding places as the rebels gathered in the low ground between rows. 60 men and women crouched in the early morning light, their faces tense but determined. Some clutched weapons taken from the main house, rifles and hunting shotguns, while others held farm tools transformed into instruments of war, scythes, pitchforks, and hoes with sharpened edges. Zachariah stood at the center, his voice low but carrying across the hushed gathering. He had spent the night walking the plantation boundaries, studying the land he'd worked for years, but never truly seen through a fighter's eyes. "They'll come from the main road first," he said, pointing toward the tree-lined avenue that led to where the grand house once stood. "That's what they know, what they expect. But the ground there isn't in their favor." He knelt and used a stick to draw crude lines in the soil. The rebels leaned forward, watching as he mapped out their world. "We've dug trenches here and here," he continued, marking the spots. "Covered them with branches and cotton stalks. Their horses will stumble, break legs. In these 3 spots, we've planted sharpened stakes pointing outward. Anyone charging through will be impaled." A few rebels nodded grimly. They had worked through the night digging those defenses, their hands calloused from years of forced labor, now willingly blistered for freedom. "Samuel, Isaiah, and Ruth will be in the trees," Zachariah said, looking at the 3 youngest adults among them. "You have the best eyes. You'll signal when they approach." "How many? Which direction?" The 3 nodded, faces solemn with responsibility. "The rest of us stay hidden until they're drawn in. No shooting until you hear my signal. We don't have bullets to waste." Big John, massive and strong from years hauling cotton bales, spoke up. "What about the western edge by the creek?" "That's our escape route if things go wrong," Zachariah answered. "Mercy has organized supplies there. Food, water, bandages. If I give the signal to retreat, that's where we head. Not scattered, but together." Heads nodded in understanding, but Zachariah noticed the fear still evident in many eyes. These were field hands and house servants, not soldiers. Yesterday's victory had been fueled by surprise and rage. Today would test their resolve. The gathering shifted as a young man named Elijah pushed his way forward. His face was twisted with anxiety, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning. "This is madness," he said, voice cracking. "We're going to die here, all of us. They have trained men, horses, guns. We should run while we still can." Murmurs rippled through the group. Zachariah saw doubt spreading like ripples in a pond. "If we run, we die separately," Zachariah countered. "They'll hunt us down one by one. And if we stay, we die together." Elijah challenged, his voice rising. "How is that better? My cousin made it to Ohio last year. Said there's people there who help runaways. We should head north, not wait here to be slaughtered." More voices joined in, the unified front fracturing as fear took hold. Some sided with Elijah, others with Zachariah. The argument grew louder, threatening to alert any scouts Edward might have sent ahead. "Enough," Zachariah hissed, but the debate had taken on a life of its own. Then, from the edge of the gathering, Mercy stepped forward. Unlike the others, she moved with a strange calm, her eyes clear and focused. The arguing slowly died down as she walked to the center beside her brother. "I know you're afraid," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I am too. But listen to me now." She looked around the circle, meeting each person's gaze in turn. "I've spent my life in that house listening to the master and his friends talk. I know how they think. They don't see us as people who can fight back. They expect us to run, to scatter like scared rabbits." She knelt and touched the soil, lifting a handful and letting it sift through her fingers. "This land has our blood in it, our sweat, our tears. For generations now, it has the master's blood too. For the first time, we have a chance to stand together, not as slaves, but as free people, defending what should have been ours all along." Her words settled over the group. Even Elijah's breathing slowed as he listened. "If we separate now, we're just runaways." But together Mercy stood straight, suddenly seeming taller than her small frame. "Together, we're something they've never seen before, something they fear." The silence that followed held weight. Zachariah watched as faces changed, fear giving way to resolve. Even Elijah, still clearly terrified, gave a reluctant nod. "We stand together," Big John said firmly. "We fight together." Others murmured agreement. The moment of crisis passed, unity restored by Mercy's quiet strength. Zachariah squeezed his sister's hand in silent thanks, then returned to organizing their defense. The rebels dispersed to their positions, some to the drainage ditches that crisscrossed the fields, others behind the sturdy walls of the smokehouse and barn. The three lookouts climbed carefully chosen trees, with clear sightlines to the approach roads. The waiting was the hardest part. Minutes stretched into an hour, then two. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist and revealing the full devastation of the plantation, the blackened ruins of the main house, the trampled fields, the hanging body of Master Thornton still swinging gently from the oak tree as a grim reminder of how everything had changed. Just as the tension began to fray nerves again, a soft whistle came from the trees, the signal they'd agreed upon. Samuel, perched in the highest branches of an old elm, pointed urgently toward the eastern treeline. Movement flickered between the distant trunks. Sunlight glinted off metal, gun barrels or belt buckles. Edward's men were approaching, but not from the main road as expected. They were coming through the woods, trying to flank the plantation. Zachariah signaled for everyone to stay down, to hold position. The rebels pressed themselves lower in the cotton rows, barely breathing. The first shot came without warning, a sharp crack that echoed across the fields. A bullet whistled overhead, embedding itself in the barn door. Then another and another. "They're trying to draw us out," Zachariah called, keeping his voice low enough that only those nearest could hear. "Stay down. Don't return fire yet." He crawled through the cotton rows, staying below the leafy tops, moving from group to relay instructions. The rebels watched with wide eyes as bullets continued to tear through leaves above them, kicking up dirt nearby. More shots rang out from the treeine. Edward's voice carried across the field, taunting them. Come out, face me like men if you dare, or die hiding like the cowards you are." Zachariah reached Big John's position behind a water trough. "They don't know exactly where we are," he whispered. "They're wasting ammunition. Let them." A bullet splintered wood inches from Zachariah's head. He ducked lower, heart pounding. "When do we shoot back?" Big John asked, rifle clutched in his massive hands. "When they're closer," Zachariah replied. "When every shot counts." The firing from the treeine intensified. Leaves and cotton bolls rained down as bullets tore through the field. The rebels pressed themselves into the earth, waiting. Then came the sound they'd been dreading. Hoofbeat. Edward was sending riders into the field. "Ready," Zachariah called, loud enough now for all to hear. "Wait for them to reach the first trench." The thunder of approaching horses grew louder. Through gaps in the cotton plants, they could see riders emerging from the trees. Edward himself at the lead, his face contorted with rage. "Now!" Zachariah shouted as the first horses neared their hidden defenses. "Fire!" The first riders crashed into the hidden trench with sickening screams. Horses tumbled, throwing their riders forward into the sharpened stakes. Edward, riding just behind the lead men, pulled his horse up short as chaos erupted. "Fire again!" Zachariah shouted. Muskballs tore through the air, finding targets among the confused riders. Edward's voice rang out, commanding his remaining men to spread out. "Flank them! Find them!" The battle spread across the fields like wildfire. Rebels rose from hiding places, firing stolen weapons and then ducking back down. Those without guns wielded hoes, scythes, and axes. Farm tools transformed into weapons of war. The sun climbed higher in the sky. As the fighting continued, noon came and went, marked only by increasing heat and thirst. Smoke drifted across the fields from burning outbuildings and gunfire, creating an eerie fog that made it hard to see friend from foe. Zachariah moved through the chaos like a ghost, appearing where needed most. He helped Big John reload a musket with trembling hands. He dragged a wounded woman to safety behind a stone wall. He shouted encouragement when morale wavered. "They're breaking through on the west side," came a cry from one of the lookout. Zachariah ran, crouched low, following the sounds of fresh fighting. A group of Edward's men had discovered the path along the creek and were pushing inward. 3 rebels lay dead, their bodies sprawled in awkward poses. 2 more fought desperately, outnumbered. With a roar, Zachariah charged forward, firing his musket at point-blank range. The closest rider fell. Zachariah swung the empty gun like a club, knocking another man from his horse. He grabbed a fallen knife and slashed wildly. A bullet grazed his shoulder, burning like fire. He stumbled but kept fighting. "Fall back," he ordered the surviving rebels. To the smokehouse they retreated step by bloody step. Edward's men pressed their advantage, thinking they had found the weak point in the defense. What they found instead was the full force of rebels who had circled around behind the smokehouse. A volley of gunfire cut down the front riders. The rest turned to flee, only to find themselves trapped between rebel positions. The afternoon stretched endlessly, the fighting turning from organized assaults to scattered skirmishes. Men and women fell on both sides. The cotton fields, once pristine white, were stained with red. Smoke hung thick in the air, stinging eyes and throats. Around 3, a strange sight appeared at the edge of the battlefield. A lone figure approached from the eastern woods, holding something white. The man moved with purpose, but no weapon. "Hold fire!" Zachariah called, spotting the figure. "Something's happening!" The man drew closer. He wore the rough clothes of Edward's men, but his face was unfamiliar to Zachariah. His white flag was simply a torn rag tied to a stick. "I want to talk," the man called out. "Don't shoot," Zachariah signaled for two rebels to cover him with muskets while he stepped forward. "That's close enough," Zachariah said when the stranger was 20 paces away. "State your business." The man lowered his flag slightly. "My name's Thomas Hale. I've been working for the Thorntons, not by choice. I'm indentured to them for 3 more years. His voice carried a northern accent. "I want to help you." "Why would you help us?" Zachariah demanded, suspicion evident in his tone. Thomas's face hardened. "Because I've spent 5 years being beaten and worked half to death by Silas Thornton, and his son is worse. I'm white, but I'm poor. To them, I'm barely better than you. I've been waiting for a chance to escape." Mercy appeared at Zachariah's side, studying the stranger intently. "He's telling the truth," she said quietly. "I've seen him around the property. Master Silas had him whipped last month for dropping a crate of china." Thomas nodded grimly. "That's right. 20 lashes for an accident." He pulled down his collar, revealing fresh scars across his shoulder. "I'm not your enemy." "What help can you offer?" Zachariah asked, still wary. "I know Edward's plans. I know the patrol routes. I know which plantations have sent men and which refused." Thomas looked around nervously. "They'll attack again at dusk from 3 directions. They're bringing more men and torches to burn you out." Zachariah exchanged glances with Mercy and Big John, who had joined them. "Could be a trap," Big John rumbled. "It could," Thomas agreed, "but it's not. Look, I can lead you through the backwoods. There's a path the hunters use that Edward doesn't know about. You can escape or set up a new defense, whichever you choose." Zachariah studied the man's face, looking for deception. He saw only desperation and a familiar rage, the same that burned in his own heart. "If you're lying," Zachariah said slowly, "I'll kill you myself." Thomas nodded. "Fair enough." With the battle temporarily stalled as both sides regrouped, Zachariah gathered the rebel leaders. 20 had died in the fighting, with 15 more wounded. Ammunition was running low. The decision was made quickly. They would follow Thomas's escape route and establish a new position. As the sun began its descent, the rebels slipped away in small groups. Thomas led them along a narrow deer trail that wound through dense underbrush and across a shallow part of the creek. Mercy helped the wounded, moving with surprising strength for her small frame. Zachariah took up the rear, watching for pursuit. The sounds of fighting faded behind them as Edward's men realized too late that their prey had vanished. By nightfall, they had reached a clearing deep in the woods, far enough from the plantation to be safe for the moment. The rebels collapsed in exhaustion, tending wounds and sharing the little food they had managed to bring. Thomas knelt in the dirt near the campfire they had dared to light. With a stick, he began drawing lines and marks. "This is the main road," he explained, pointing to a long line. "Edward has men stationed here, here, and here." He marked 3 spots, but this back road is clear. The militia from Claiborne refused to help. There's bad blood between their captain and Edward. Mercy moved closer, studying the crude map intently. Her eyes traced each mark, committing them to memory. "What about the bridges?" she asked. "Are they watched?" Thomas looked up in surprise. "You can read maps." "I can read," she said simply. "Are the bridges watched? The main one is, this smaller one isn't. Most folks don't even know it exists." As Thomas continued marking patrol routes and safe passages, Zachariah watched the faces around the fire. Despite the day's horror, despite the losses, he saw something unexpected in their eyes. Not just fear, but determination. They had fought back and survived. They had tasted freedom, however briefly. This was no longer just about hanging Silas Thornton. It wasn't even just about escaping. Something larger had been born in the blood-soaked fields. A realization that they could fight together, think together, plan together. Zachariah looked at Mercy, her face illuminated by firelight as she studied Thomas's maps. Her literacy, once a dangerous secret, was now a weapon in their arsenal. Thomas, a white man who had crossed the uncrossable line to join them, marked another safe path through the woods. Survival today, perhaps something more tomorrow. Dawn broke with a crimson glow that matched their intentions. Zachariah crouched in the tall grass at the edge of the cotton fields, watching as the eastern sky brightened. Beside him, Thomas Hale pointed to a ridge where Edward's men had camped for the night. "They'll come through here," Thomas whispered, tracing a path with his finger. "Edward always takes the direct approach. His pride won't let him do otherwise." Zachariah nodded, studying the terrain. The rebels had spent the night preparing. Women had torn strips of cloth and soaked them in the last of the lamp oil. Men had positioned themselves in a wide half-circle, hidden in the grass and behind the trees. The cotton fields, still full and white, stretched between them and Edward's position. "Everyone knows what to do," Zachariah asked, looking around at the faces gathered close. Big John nodded. "We're ready." Mercy squeezed her brother's arm. "Be careful," she said softly. "Stay hidden until it's done," Zachariah told her firmly. "Watch the signal." The minutes stretched as they waited. The sounds of horses and men grew louder from beyond the ridge. Thomas touched Zachariah's shoulder and pointed. "There," he said. Edward Thornton appeared first, riding a black horse. His face was tight with anger, his clothes still fine despite the previous day's battle. Behind him rode 20 men, some from neighboring plantations, others hired guns. They approached confidently, believing the rebels had fled deeper into the woods. Zachariah waited until they were halfway across the cotton field. He raised his hand, then dropped it. The field erupted in flames. Rebels hidden among the cotton plants had crept out before dawn, placing oil-soaked rags throughout the field. At Zachariah's signal, they touched torches to the rags. Fire spread rapidly through the dry cotton, creating a wall of flame and smoke. The horses reared in panic. Men shouted in confusion. Edward's voice rose above the chaos, ordering his men to push through, but the smoke was already too thick, choking both riders and mounts. "Now!" Zachariah shouted. From 3 sides, rebels charged forward with a wild cry. They fired muskets into the smoke, then rushed in with axes, hoes, and scythes. The advantage of surprise was complete. Thomas ran beside Zachariah, wielding a stolen pistol. "Left flank," he called, pointing to where some of Edward's men were trying to circle around the fire. Zachariah signaled to Big John, who led a group to cut off the escape. The sounds of battle rose. Gunshots, screams, the neighing of panicked horses, and the crackling roar of the burning cotton. The smoke created a hellish scene. Figures appeared and disappeared in the haze. The morning sun, filtering through the smoke, cast everything in an orange glow. Zachariah moved through it like a vengeful spirit, striking down any white man who crossed his path. An overseer, Zachariah recognized, the one who had whipped old Samuel the day before Silas's death, stumbled through the smoke, coughing. Their eyes met. The overseer raised his gun, but Zachariah was faster. The chain he had used on Silas whipped out, wrapping around the man's wrist. Zachariah yanked hard, pulling the overseer off balance, then swung his knife. Another figure down. Another step toward freedom. The battle shifted as Edward's remaining men tried to retreat. The rebels pressed their advantage, driving them back towards the ridge. Zachariah found himself standing in a cleared area, smoke swirling around him. He could see the battle spread out before him, his people forcing Edward's men to flee. "Push them back," he shouted, his voice carrying across the field. "Don't let them regroup." The rebels surged forward with renewed energy. Thomas appeared at Zachariah's side, his face stir with soot. "It's working," he said, amazement in his voice. "They're breaking." Edward's forces scattered, no longer fighting as a unit, but as individual men desperate to escape. Some threw down their weapons and ran, others fought fiercely to the end. Zachariah spotted Edward himself, still mounted but retreating up the ridge. Their eyes met across the distance. Edward's face contorted with hatred. He raised his pistol and fired, but the shot went wide in his haste. Before Zachariah could pursue, another group of riders broke through the smoke, fleeing east. The rebels gave chase, shouting in triumph. The fields burned brightly now, black smoke billowing into the morning sky. The plantation that had been their prison was becoming their victory ground. Zachariah stood tall, watching as Edward's men disappeared over the ridge. For the first time since the rebellion began, he allowed himself to believe they might win. The rebels regrouped, counting their losses and gathering weapons from the fallen. Despite injuries and exhaustion, their faces shone with fierce joy. They had faced their oppressors and driven them back. The impossible had happened. "Zachariah," Big John called, waving from across the smoldering field. "We got most of them." Edward and maybe 5 others got away, heading back toward town. Cheers erupted from the gathered rebels. Women and men embraced, crying and laughing at once. Thomas stood awkwardly to one side until someone pulled him into the celebration. Zachariah searched the crowd for Mercy. He hadn't seen her during the battle. She was supposed to stay hidden with the other non-fighters. Relief washed over him as the adrenaline of battle began to fade. They had won this fight. Mercy would be safe now. "Where's Mercy?" he asked a woman who passed by. She shrugged, caught up in the moment of victory. A cold feeling settled in Zachariah's stomach. He pushed through the celebrating crowd, calling his sister's name. No answer came. "Has anyone seen Mercy?" he shouted, panic rising in his voice. The celebrations quieted as people looked around, suddenly aware of the absence. A young boy tugged at Zachariah's sleeve. "I saw her," he said, his voice small. "During the fighting, she was helping the wounded, bringing water." "Where?" Zachariah demanded. The boy pointed toward the eastern edge of the field, where the smoke was still thick. Zachariah ran, shouting Mercy's name. Thomas and Big John followed. Sensing his fear, they found the water bucket she had been carrying overturned in the dirt. Nearby, the ground showed signs of struggle, disturbed earth, blood drops. Then Zachariah heard it, a distant scream that cut through the sounds of the burning fields. A woman's voice, Mercy's voice. He turned toward the sound in time to see figures disappearing into the tree-line far to the east. Several men on horseback, and with them, struggling against her captors. "Mercy, Mercy!" Zachariah's roar echoed across the field, but it was too late. The riders vanished into the woods. Thomas grabbed Zachariah's arm as he started to run after them. "It's Edward," he said grimly. "I recognize his men. They must have circled around during the confusion." The rebels gathered around Zachariah, their faces fallen from jubilation to horror. The battlefield still glowing with fire, the smoke still rising from their victory, suddenly felt empty and meaningless. Zachariah stared at the spot where his sister had disappeared, his heart turning to stone in his chest. The chain that had started this rebellion hung heavy at his side. Night fell over the forest like a heavy blanket. The rebels had retreated deep into the woods, far enough from the plantation that the glow of the still burning fields was just a dim orange line on the horizon. Their victory celebration had died quickly after Mercy's capture. Now, huddled around small, carefully hidden fires, the mood was somber and tense. Zachariah sat on a fallen log, his face hard as stone, staring into the flames. No one dared approach him. The chain he had used to kill Silas Thornton lay coiled beside him, a reminder of how this rebellion had begun. Thomas Hale stood before the largest group, his voice low but urgent. "We've won a battle, but Edward will return with more men. We should head for the great dismal swamp. There are communities of free people there." "And leave Mercy," Big John interrupted, his deep voice rumbling through the clearing. "Leave her to die." Arguments broke out around the fires. Fear and exhaustion had frayed nerves. Some agreed with Thomas, insisting that the only chance for survival was to flee deeper into the wilderness. Others stood with Big John, loyal to the young woman who had tended their wounds and given them courage. "We can't abandon her," cried Sarah, an older woman who had helped raise both Zachariah and Mercy after their mother died. "That child risked everything alongside us." "And what about our children?" countered another woman, pulling her young son closer. "If we try to save one, we might lose all." The debate grew louder until Zachariah suddenly stood. The camp fell silent. "I'm going after Mercy," he said simply. His voice was flat, leaving no room for argument. "Those who want to leave, leave. I won't stop you." He turned away from the group, walking to the edge of the clearing. Thomas followed him, concern etched on his dirt-streaked face. "Zachariah," he said quietly, "I understand she's your sister, but Edward is setting a trap. He wants you to come." "I know that." Zachariah didn't look at him. "He'll have men waiting. You'll be walking into death." Zachariah finally turned, his eyes reflecting the distant fires. "My sister is all I have. Would you do any different if it was your family?" Thomas had no answer. Big John approached carrying a rifle taken from one of Edward's fallen men. "2 scouts just returned," he reported. "They found where Edward's holed up. Old Miller's barn, about 3 mir east. He's got maybe 8 men with him." "And Mercy?" Zachariah asked, his voice suddenly tight. Big John's expression darkened. "They've got her tied up inside." Scouts heard Edward shouting loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "He says he wants you. Zachariah says you have until dawn to surrender yourself, or he couldn't finish." Zachariah nodded slowly. "Then I'll go at dawn." "To die?" Thomas asked incredulously. "To get my sister back?" Zachariah answered. Sarah pushed through the crowd, her thin frame vibrating with anger. "That devil's son took my baby from the fields right under our noses. We can't just walk in there and hand ourselves over." More voices joined in, the argument flaring up again. Some insisted on trying to rescue Mercy, others that the risk was too great. "Enough." Zachariah's voice cut through the noise. "I'm not asking anyone to come with me. This started with me and Silas. It's between me and Edward now." "No." Big John shook his head firmly. "It's not just your fight anymore, it's all of ours." Murmurs of agreement rose from some of the gathered rebels. Others looked away, fear plain on their faces. Exhaustion suddenly overtook Zachariah, the weight of leadership, the terror for his sister, the knowledge that he had brought this upon them all. It crashed down on him at once. Without another word, he walked away from the camp, deeper into the darkness of the trees. Behind him, the arguments continued, but more quietly now. The group was splitting. Some would leave before dawn, seeking safety in the swamps. Others would stay, loyal to the end. Zachariah found a small clearing where he could see the burning horizon through a gap in the trees. He sat heavily on the ground, finally alone with his thoughts. He picked up the rusted chain he had carried since that first night and ran his fingers along its links. The metal was cold and rough against his skin. He remembered wrapping it around Silas Thornton's neck, remembered the man's eyes bulging as he lifted him to the oak branch. In that moment, Zachariah had felt power for the first time in his life, the power to take revenge, to deliver justice. But now Mercy was paying the price for his actions. The sound of footsteps made him tense. but it was only Thomas approaching cautiously. "Some are leaving," Thomas said, sitting beside him. "The women with children mostly. The rest are staying for you and Mercy." Zachariah nodded but said nothing. "Edward's not like his father," Thomas continued. "Silas was cruel but calculated. Edward is wild, unpredictable. He won't keep his word even if you surrender." "I know that," Zachariah said quietly. "Then what's your plan? Walk in there and die?" Zachariah finally looked at Thomas, his eyes reflecting the distant fires. "No, I plan to kill Edward Thornton with this same chain." He held up the rusted links. "And anyone else who stands between me and my sister." Thomas was silent for a long moment. "You started something bigger than yourself. You know, people are talking about this rebellion for miles around. Slaves on other plantations are watching, waiting to see what happens." "I didn't ask for that," Zachariah said harshly. "No one asks to become a symbol." Thomas stood up. "But you are one now, for better or worse." After Thomas left, Zachariah sat alone for hours, watching the burning horizon, the chain cold in his hands. The choice before him was impossible. Surrender and likely die without saving Mercy, or attack and risk everyone who followed him. But in his heart, the decision was already made. He would not leave his sister. He would not abandon her to Edward's revenge. Since childhood he had protected her, taught her in secret, risked punishment to keep her safe. He would not stop now. Zachariah gripped the chain tighter, feeling the rust bite into his palms. The distant fires of the plantation burned steadily against the night sky, a reminder of what they had accomplished and what they had lost. Dawn would come. Edward was waiting, and so was Mercy. Zachariah would be ready. Inside Miller's barn, the air hung heavy with dust and the smell of fear. Lanterns cast long shadows across the hay-strewn floor, illuminating Mercy's face as she sat bound to a wooden post in the center of the space. Her wrists were raw from the ropes, but she kept her expression neutral, refusing to show pain. Edward Thornton paced before her, his boots crunching on scattered straw. Unlike his father's cold calculation, Edward's rage burned hot and unpredictable. His face was flushed with drink, his eyes wild in the lantern light. "Your brother thinks he's so clever," Edward sneered, stopping to lean close to Mercy's face. "Hanging my father like a common criminal, but come dawn he'll learn what real justice looks like." Mercy said nothing, her eyes downcast. She had spent the hours of her captivity watching, listening, memorizing. 6 men remained with Edward. 2 stood guard outside. The others lounged against the barn walls, rifles propped beside them, passing a bottle between them. Nothing to say. Edward grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him. "Your brother found his courage. Where's yours?" Mercy met his gaze steadily. "My brother gave us hope," she said softly. "Something your father spent years trying to beat out of us." Edward's hand struck her face, snapping her head to the side. The sound echoed through the barn. One of the men shifted uncomfortably. "Hope?" Edward laughed bitterly. "By sunrise they'll find your body swinging from the same tree where my father died. And when your brother comes for you, he'll join you there." He turned away, barking orders at his men to keep watch. Mercy tasted blood in her mouth but remained silent. Her fingers worked behind her back, feeling the small items she had managed to keep hidden. A stub of pencil tucked into her hair, scraps of paper she'd smuggled in the lining of her dress. Hours earlier, when they'd first dragged her to the barn, they'd searched her roughly but carelessly. They hadn't thought to check for the small tools of literacy she always kept close, her most dangerous possession, her secret weapon. As Edward stalked away to drink with his men, Mercy twisted her wrists, working the ropes against a rough edge of the wooden post. The hemp fibers slowly frayed. She knew she couldn't break free completely, not yet, but she could create enough slack to reach what she needed. Night deepened. Two of the men dozed off, slumped against the barn wall. Another stepped outside to relieve the guards. Edward sat on an overturned bucket, taking long pulls from his bottle, his eyes never leaving Mercy. "You know," he said, his words slightly slurred, "my father always said, your kind couldn't think for yourselves, but I saw those burned ledgers. I know someone who can read, set those fires." Mercy remained silent. "Was it you?" Edward stood unsteadily. "Did my father find out his property was learning things she shouldn't?" "We're not property," Mercy said quietly. "We never were." Edward laughed, the sound sharp and ugly in the quiet barn. "Tell that to the law. Tell that to every white man from here to Washington." He swaggered closer, crouching before her. "My father was too soft. Selling you was mercy. I would have cut out your tongue for such defiance." Behind her back, Mercy's fingers had finally worked loose enough to reach the hidden pencil stub. As Edward turned away again, she carefully extracted a small piece of paper from her dress hem. The men were talking among themselves now, their voices low. Mercy caught fragments. Complaints about being stationed at the barn, fears about the rebels attacking, wishes to return to the main group of riders who had retreated to regroup. Mercy bent her head, appearing defeated, while her hands worked frantically behind the post. The pencil scratched softly on paper as she wrote in a careful, clear hand, exactly the way she'd seen Silas Thornton write his orders. She'd spent years secretly studying his penmanship on discarded notes. "Captain requires all men at Southfield Crossing. Rebels spotted moving through woods. Bring prisoner. Urgent." Her heart pounded as she finished. The forgery wasn't perfect, but in the dim light, to tired and nervous men, it might work. She needed just one moment of confusion. Dawn was approaching. Pink light began to filter through the cracks in the barn walls. Outside, birds started their morning calls. Edward stood, stretching. "Time to prepare your brother's welcome," he announced. He gestured to two of his men. "Get her ready. I want her hanging before the sun fully rises." As the men approached, Mercy saw her chance. One of them untied her from the post, but kept her wrists bound. As he pulled her to her feet, she stumbled deliberately, falling against him. "Watch it," he growled, shoving her upright. "Sorry," she whispered, slipping the forged note into his pocket in one smooth motion. The man didn't notice. He dragged her toward the barn door where Edward waited, sword drawn. Outside, the sky was lightening from black to deep blue. "Check the perimeter once more," Edward ordered another man. "I don't want any surprises." The man nodded, stepping outside. Moments later, he rushed back in, face tense. "Sir, message from the captain." He held out Mercy's forged note, which had clearly made its way from one man to another. Edward snatched it, scanning the words with a frown. "When did this come?" "Just now, sir." Ryder dropped it and continued to the others. Confusion spread across Edward's face. "What Ryder? What captain?" His eyes narrowed with suspicion, but the damage was done. The men looked to each other uncertainly, their confidence shaken. "Sir, if the rebels are at the South Crossing," one began. "There is no South Crossing," Edward shouted. This is before he could finish, shouts erupted outside. One of the guards fired his rifle. The barn door burst open as a guard stumbled backward, blood blooming on his shirt. In the chaos, Mercy acted. She rammed her shoulder into the distracted man holding her, breaking his grip. Her partially loosened bonds gave her just enough freedom to move. She ducked beneath Edward's wild swing and darted for the back of the barn, where she had noticed a rotted board earlier. "Stop her!" Edward roared, but the men were scattering, confused by the note and the gunfire outside. Mercy kicked at the weak board, splintering it. The opening was small, but she was smaller. She squeezed through, feeling the wood tear at her dress and skin. Then she was outside in the misty dawn light. Gunfire continued from the front of the barn. Smoke drifted across the field. Her brother's diversion, she realized, heart pounding, blood trickling from scrapes on her arms and face. Mercy ran. The field stretched before her, tall grass providing some cover. Behind her, Edward's voice bellowed commands, growing more distant. She kept running, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her bare feet finding their way over the uneven ground. The smoke thickened as she approached the edge of the property, where yesterday's fires still smoldered. She could barely see through the haze, but she kept moving, knowing that somewhere ahead, Zachariah would be coming for her. Through the smoke and early morning light, Mercy spotted figures moving, a small group approaching cautiously from the tree-line. For a moment, fear clutched at her heart. Had she run straight into Edward's reinforcements? Then she saw him. Zachariah leading a handful of rebels moving silently toward the barn. The chain that had killed Silas Thornton was wrapped around his hand. Mercy stumbled forward, pushing through exhaustion. "Zachariah!" she called, her voice cracking. His head snapped up. Through the drifting smoke, their eyes met. Disbelief. Then joy flooded his face. He broke into a run, closing the distance between them. As Zachariah reached her, hope surged in Mercy's chest. She had done it. She had saved herself. And now, together, they would finish what they started. Zachariah wrapped his arms around Mercy, crushing her against his chest, his hands trembling as they touched her face, her shoulders, assuring himself she was real. "You're alive," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I thought I used what you taught me," Mercy said, her eyes bright despite her exhaustion. "I wrote false orders, created confusion." Thomas Hale stepped forward from the small group of rebels. "They're still disorganized," he said urgently. "Edward will regroup soon. We need to strike now." Zachariah nodded, his expression hardening as he turned to the others. "Samuel, Hannah, circle around behind the barn. Elijah, you and Joseph take the east side. Thomas and I will approach from the front." He looked down at Mercy, reluctant to let her go. "Stay here, hidden in the trees." "No," Mercy said firmly, "I won't be left behind again." She picked up a fallen branch, gripping it like a club. "I can fight too." Zachariah studied her face, seeing not just his little sister, but a woman who had saved herself through courage and wit. He nodded once. "Stay close to me." The rebels moved swiftly through the tall grass, using the lingering smoke as cover. From the barn came shouting, Edward organizing his remaining men, their voices tense with panic. "6 men left at most," Thomas whispered. "2 injured from our earlier shots." They crept closer, crouching low. The sun was rising quickly now, burning through the morning mist. Zachariah signaled with his hand, and the rebels spread out surrounding the barn. Inside, Edward's voice rose in anger. "Find her. She couldn't have gotten far." Zachariah caught Mercy's eye and nodded. It was time. He raised his rifle and fired a shot into the air. The barn fell silent. "Edward Thornton," Zachariah called, his voice carrying across the field. "Your men are surrounded. Come out now, or we burn the barn with you inside." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the barn door creaked open. 2 men emerged, hands raised, their faces star with sweat and fear. "Where is he?" Zachariah demanded. Before they could answer, gunfire erupted from the back of the barn. Edward had slipped out the same hole Mercy had escaped through. "There!" Samuel shouted from his position. Edward ran desperately across the open field toward the trees, firing wildly behind him. 3 more of his men followed, guns blazing. "After them!" Zachariah shouted. The rebels gave chase, returning fire. One of Edward's men fell, then another. The third threw down his rifle and fell to his knees, hands raised in surrender. But Edward kept running, his fine clothes now torn and dirty, his face contorted with rage and fear. He reached the tree-line and disappeared into the woods. Zachariah pursued him relentlessly, the chain still wrapped around his hand. Behind him, Mercy and Thomas followed, with the other rebels securing the surrendered men. In the woods, Edward's trail was easy to follow. Broken branches, disturbed leaves, the desperate path of a man running blind with fear. Zachariah moved more carefully, alert for an ambush. They found Edward at the old oak tree, the very one where Silas still hung, his body swaying gently in the morning breeze. Edward stood beneath it, chest heaving, staring up at his father's corpse. His gun was empty, the hammer clicking on spent chambers. He turned as Zachariah emerged from the trees, Mercy and Thomas close behind. A wild laugh escaped Edward's lips. "So this is how it ends," he said, tossing away his useless pistol. "Like father, like son." Zachariah stepped forward, unwrapping the chain from his hand. "You had a choice," he said quietly. "Your father had a choice. Every day you chose cruelty." "Cruelty," Edward spat. "We gave you life, food, shelter. You gave us chains," Mercy said, stepping up beside her brother. "You took our names, our families, our freedom." Edward's eyes darted between them, then to the others emerging from the trees. He was cornered now, trapped beneath his father's hanging body. "You'll never be free," he snarled. "Every white man in the county will hunt you down. Every slave patrol from here to Tennessee will have your description." "Perhaps," Zachariah said, "but you won't be alive to see it." He moved forward suddenly, the chain whipping out. Edward tried to dodge, but Zachariah was faster, stronger. The chain wrapped around Edward's neck, and he choked, clawing at the metal links. Zachariah dragged him toward the base of the oak tree, Edward fighting every step, but his strength was no match for Zachariah's determination. The other rebels watched in silence as Zachariah threw the chain over the same branch from which Silas hung. Edward's eyes bulged, his face weening as he gasped for breath. "Wait," he choked out. "I can pay you. Can you pay back 20 years of my life?" Zachariah asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Can you pay for the scars on my back, the graves of children worked to death in your fields?" Mercy placed her hand on Zachariah's arm, not to stop him, but in solidarity. Her eyes were hard as she looked at Edward. "This is justice," she said simply. With a powerful heave, Zachariah pulled the chain. Edward's feet left the ground, his body rising beside his father's. His legs kicked frantically, boots scraping against the air. His hands clawed at his throat, face turning purple. The rebels watched silently as Edward's struggles weakened, then ceased altogether. Father and son hung side by side from the old oak's branches, a grim testament to the revolt that had consumed the Thornton plantation. Zachariah tied off the chain and stepped back, his face expressionless as he stared up at the bodies. The only sound was the creaking of the branches and the distant crackle of flames from the burning fields. "It's done," Thomas said quietly. Zachariah nodded, turning away from the tree. "Gather everyone," he ordered. "We need to move before reinforcements arrived from town." As they walked back toward the plantation, smoke billowed into the sky. The main house was fully engulfed now, columns crumbling as fire devoured wood and stone alike. The fields burned, too, years of cotton harvests feeding the flames. The rebels had gathered by the edge of the property, 30 men, women, and children who had survived the revolt. Some were wounded, all were exhausted, but in their eyes shone a fierce light that hadn't been there before. "Where will we go?" a woman asked, clutching a small child to her chest. "Some of us know the way to the swamps," an older man said. "There are communities there, free people living hidden. Others can try for the north," Thomas added. "I know routes, safe houses." The group began to split, some heading toward the dense swamplands to the south, others preparing to risk the long journey north. Tearful goodbyes were exchanged, along with promises to remember, to tell the story of what happened here. Zachariah and Mercy stood at the crossroads, watching as their companions chose their paths. Behind them, the Thornton Plantation, the only home they had ever known, their prison for decades crumbled into ash and ruin. "Where will we go?" Mercy asked softly. Zachariah looked down at her, then at the long road stretching northward. "Wherever we choose," he said. "That's what freedom means." They walked together down the dirt road, leaving behind the hanging tree with its grim fruit. The morning sun cast their long shadows before them, and smoke curled into the clear blue sky behind. They did not look back. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.